Live
Live
streaming
streaming is on.
Hello, world. My name is Gerry Fialka. It's December 19th, 2020. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Tom Cooper. Tom, what an honor. You're my hero. The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
Total happiness. And happiness is when there's no gap between where you want to be and where you are. I think serving is another area where you're constantly aware that you have some purpose and some function, and that others appreciate and recognize and interrelate to that.
That was great. You must have ESP because you anticipated a question that's a couple steps forward, but we'll just jump right to it. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I think the two are intertwined in such a way that if you find the meaning you're looking for, you're happy. So I think in meaning itself is one dimension of happiness. There are others. Others are in community, in one-on-one relationship, in sensing if you're religious or spiritual that you've fulfilled your higher purpose. If you're not, that you've fulfilled perhaps your intellectual purpose. So I think purpose is inextricably connected to both meaning and happiness.
Wow, you are so concise. I love you. I don't have to cut you off and you don't ramble. Thank you, Tom. So, but I got that question from Viktor Frankl, basically. He says, meaning lasts and happiness doesn't. Any follow-up comment on that?
Depends on the level of happiness. When Mill was exploring pleasure and utilitarianism and so forth, there's the kind of happiness that comes from having your ice cream, which does last an hour or two. There's another from reading a good book that's inextricably meaningful and inspiring and changes directions every chapter. And there's another happiness that comes from a sense of a life fulfilled. Erickson said, you know, it's not just an identity crisis you have, but at the end of your life, you have an integrity crisis. Was my life worth it? Did I accomplish anything? And if you look back at that moment in your integrity crisis and can answer yes, that's probably the deepest level of happiness.
Yeah, I'm a midlife climax and some breakthrough, nervous breakthrough. That's what I like. But when you said Mill, what's his first name?
John Stewart.
Oh, John Stuart Mill. Okay, so that was super cool. And now the next question is, Tom, what is your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
I think it's that which is easiest to digest without being reductive. In other words, you want to know the essence of the content, but not so much so that it's designed for a 5-year-old. So whatever tells us what we need to know without oversimplifying it.
Well, you described the form of it, but I'm looking for, that's the easiest to digest. So it doesn't matter if it's print. For you in your life, was it reading or was it visual or was it direct experience? I know it's all of them, but what's your favorite of getting information?
Whatever inspires and informs the most. So the medium is secondary to that. In other words, there are horrible films and horrible books. I'm looking for the top of the line in each. I read and read and read until I was about 40 or 50. I teach visual and media arts. At a certain point, I became a film historian and film critic. And so all of those things are second nature to me, but I remain humble in this age. There's so many platforms, changes, upgrades, that I would not claim to know all of the apps, let alone discern in a gourmet way which ones are top of the line.
Wow, this is amazing. So why do you think humans gather or collect information?
Partly we have insecurity, deep standing insecurity, and psychologists want us to feel that we have answers to things like, when they ask me a question, did I give an intelligent answer? And was I suitable? Was I appropriate in that context? So a lot of people as social animals are seeking to acquire information to fit and to seem knowledgeable. And that was Socrates' concern about the sophist. They had all the appearance of knowledge, but none of the wisdom. And so I think there is a search for the wrong reasons, but I think people who are genuinely intellectually driven to discover and to solve and apply problems that can eliminate suffering or reduce ignorance, that noble search for information and intelligence is quite valid.
Is T.S. Eliot saying, I had the experience but missed the meaning, similar to what you just summarized?
You know, you gave me permission to say I don't know. I never had that conversation with him.
But you know, I think I got it from studying McLuhan, that McLuhan said he said that. But did he imply that in some of his essays or some?
Yeah, I think so. And McLuhan, of course, was an Eliot man. He really understood the four quartets and so forth, and he would have had a ready answer for that. I know Eliot to some extent, but I'm not so sure I would know the answer to that.
Really well put. Now, is gathering information, this need to collect information, more hardwired in humans, more innate, or more invented? So, of course, it's both, but it depends. But go ahead.
Yeah, it depends on which theory you accept. If you assume that human beings have evolved and that survival was dependent on their competitive intelligence with other species, obviously information that tends to promote survival and that selects for evolution, so forth, would be very important, whether or not the person thought they wanted it. And so discovery and innovation and all those things would be survival techniques and competitive techniques. And during war and battle, also defense and aggressive techniques. So you can make that kind of argument, but you can also make the argument that human beings have devolved, that they come from a higher intelligence. And virtually all world histories of spirituality and religion have that sense. Christianity calls it the fall, but many other religions speak of a golden age or a golden time or whatever. So it may be what's called anamnesis, buried memory, the loss of something. We know that we know more and we're seeking to reclaim it. But we can't answer that inner itch and scratch that inner itch entirely because we're not entirely sure what that is. And so spiritual and religious and sometimes archaeologists and anthropologists posit that we're looking for lost wisdom, not just seeking to obtain new wisdom. But either way, I think you can make an argument that there's something noble about it. If you assume it's simply evolution and survival of the fittest, I think you make a more pragmatic answer that it's simply a survival mode, and that it enhances not only survival in the lowest basest way, but also in the university and other competitive atmospheres.
Amazing. There was an A word you mentioned that I really wanted you to spell. So you called it
anamnesis.
How do you spell it?
The recovery of buried memory.
How do you spell that?
ANEMNESIS. Anamnesis. Recovery of buried memory.
Oh my God, you must have ESP, because the next question, Tom, is, can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
As a little boy, I had such a traumatic fall off of a bicycle that I had a recurring dream that my elbow had disappeared. I had hurt my elbow, but of course.
And is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Yes. Yes.
Tom,
well, let me extrapolate on that. In media studies, we have something called barbed hooks. Barbed hooks is that thing you saw that you wished you'd never seen that haunts you again and again after that. So when I was a little boy, I saw some kind of movie about ancient history where a queen requires a soldier to test her torture instrument to see if it'll work or not. And of course, he knows he's going to die and she knows he's going to die, and it doesn't matter. And I must have been 4 or 5 years old when I saw that image. That was a barbed hook, like in fishing. It stayed in my consciousness again and again and again. I wished I'd never had that memory. That's one. But then there are memories of days when suddenly I was surprised by some great breakthrough in life. I'm working a bit on a United Nations project now, and I got a call out of the clear blue that I thought must be spam to work on this project. That was one I'd always wanted to work on. And that's a memory that, I really appreciate. So
I love it. That was really well put. Tom, tell me an early role model, someone who made an impact on you, that's two parts: within your immediate family and then outside your immediate family, and keep it brief. And what did you specifically get from that person?
Well, definitely my father. My father was 100% unconditional love. He believed in all religions, all faiths, and so forth, even though he had his own. And they all came together at a pivot point of doing it rather than just preaching it or talking about it. And he was a do it kind of person. He gave and loved and cared for and was humble and never took credit for it. So he was clearly a great role model. Outside of that, I suppose my first high school teacher who taught me transcendentalism and taught me how to look at the world in a much larger way than classroom rings and letter sweaters and all of that was the first role model. His name was Mr. Wheeler, and another one, Mr. Cox. Then in college, I must have had half a dozen: Stanley Cavell, Vlada Petrik. I went to Harvard, and that was like being a kid in a candy store. Suddenly there were thousands of courses I couldn't take in high school that were really wonderful. And most of the faculty, some of them were deadly dull and some of them were pretentious and arrogant, but some of them really changed my life and changed my thinking mode. And then, of course, I met Marshall, and Marshall was the fastest pun in the West and constantly entertaining at one level and probing at another level. And of course, we all doubted him and questioned him, and he always had a quicker reply and at a different dimension than our question. So he was a different kind of role model in that he never settled into a rut about his thinking. Whereas most of my other professors, no matter how great they were, after reading their books and after taking a couple of courses with them, you pretty much could predict the direction they were going in. But Marshall was always feeding off of a different discipline, not just a different kind of book that he was writing. He was always ingesting fodder from co-authors and from many different fields, countries, cultures, and so forth. So he was a role model at constant change, constant openness, and yet he had a dogma behind that. He did have a structure behind that, but he had an unstructuring principle in the midst of that structure. So he was a role model at that epistemological level, but many of the others were at the level of the constant pursuit of truth, or at the level of really having something fresh and different to say and see.
What age did you meet Marshall?
I must have been 24, 25. Harvard had grants for studying all kinds of things, and most of my friends wanted the Marshall or the Rhodes Scholar or the really prestigious ones, but there was also one in Canada that maybe only 20 people competed for from Harvard rather than 100 or so, and that was called the Mackenzie King Scholarship, and it was for studying something unique to Canada, a resource unique to Canada. And of course, usually people went after Innesian type things, Innis type things like studying the beaver, studying the lumber trade, studying the Royal Mounted Police, something very superficially Canadian. And I said, look, I think just like the Vienna Circle, Toronto has an intellectual circle. I think Innis was part of it, Robertson Davies, Easterbrook, but definitely McLuhan. And many of the people McLuhan met with, and they had a values circle that actually sat down and discussed ideas much the same as the Vienna Circle, and he was part of that. And so I made the case that there could be intellectual resources in Canada. Why limit it to just physical resources? And they bought it. And then they renewed that. And so that gave me a chance to have a kind of special role in his life. He knew there was this guy coming up from Harvard to study with him. And although all of us graduates were humbled by his speed and his incredible ability to pole vault over anything you were thinking, still, he kind of always said, oh, there's this guy from Harvard up here just to study me. I think he had a little bit of ego attached to that. And that gave me a chance to have some interviews with him and do some things that not every graduate student would have had.
Wow. Well, Tom, did your parents raise your particular religion?
Yes, my mother was quite fundamentalist as a Baptist, but my dad as a chaplain, even though he had a Baptist background, he had to serve all of the men. And at that time, it was 98% men. More women have come into the military. And so he had to learn Buddhism, and he had to learn Judaism, and for him, it wasn't had to, it was get to learn. He loved anything spiritual. And so we had people in our house wearing turbans and clerical collars and everything else. So I was brought up holistically by him to admire the integrity of the person more than the belief system. And my mother maintained that strong kind of Christian Baptist pursuit. And I've had friends of all faiths ever since, and no faith at all, because I work in the university.
Do you pray?
Yes.
If God exists, what do you want God to tell you after you die?
So I'd much rather it be, that I'm so humble I don't have any demands on God. But nevertheless.
Can you forget to die, Tom?
I may be eternal. I have that sensing. I don't have the fear of death.
I may be eternal. That's better than the McLuhanism. I may be eternal. I think someone already said that. Do thoughts create emotions?
I think they interact. And if somebody says something to you that is a thought that's threatening to you, it creates an emotion. But if we look at this physiologically, we have emotions that come from our hormonal system, and thoughts tend to come from our cerebral system. The two interact, and we're often emotion driven in our thinking. For example, if we fear a particular candidate taking over, our mind will come up with all kinds of reasons about what's wrong with that candidate. And we know that from psychology and social psychology, that rationalization as a process is cognition or thought that's based on emotion, basically.
Does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness?
I think it's part of a larger realm of consciousness. It sees itself as having an independent consciousness, but I feel consciousness is universal. And that's why somebody can die in another continent who's closely related to us, and we feel it at the time. Or there can be an assassination and the whole world is in shock before they turn on the TV to see why. I think that level of interconnectedness of consciousness is there.
Is that sometimes referred to as ESP?
It may be a dimension of what some people call ESP, but ESP certainly would go beyond that, should it exist. And I'm both a clinician and not a clinician about that. In other words, the clinical research tends to suggest consciousness matters. If everyone prays at the same time in a large group or organization of people, I think we do have a sense that something changes in the world, whether or not it has the impact they want. So I think that's a dimension of what some people call ESP. It really depends on what they call. I mean, Edgar Cayce was someone who I met, and I knew his son really well because Virginia Beach, where I went to high school, was where his ARE was held. And he was perhaps seen as the champion of ESP research at the time, his ARE center and so forth. Some of it I'm buying, and some of it felt like ego tripping, and some of it felt like over the edge. But then there's a part of me that says, who am I to judge? If I were in that person's head and consciousness, it might be precisely the way I see the world.
Where'd you get the suspended judgment from? It seems as though something I hear Marshall say, understanding is not having a point of view. Is that from your dad having that comprehensive, that Pascal thing that sort of like, in order to understand anything, you got to understand this end of the spectrum and that? Where'd you get that from?
Yeah, well, in the Christian end of the spectrum, judge not is about the shortest verse in the Bible other than Jesus wept, right? They're both two words, judge not. And then it goes on, lest you be not judged. But I think you find that in almost all cultures at the highest point of wisdom. There's kind of an understanding of the boomerang effect, which is that what you put out comes back. In the Judeo-Christian world, we talk about sowing and reaping, right? But we talk about karma more in the Hindu world. And on the street, we call what goes around comes around. Or if we don't believe in any of those things and we've gotten ourselves into science and we're into Newton's third law, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So all of those things would say it's in your self-interest, even if you're not altruistic, not to be overly judgmental, because that's exactly how other people are going to perceive you in the long or the short of it. It may not be immediately, but eventually what you put down is going to put you down. So I think there's a universal wisdom about that at the highest level, but most of us give in to judgment. And there's always the question about, don't we need righteous judgment or don't we need great criticism? In the university, that's a core belief. The critical thinking is far better than acceptance.
Tom, what do you go to bed at night?
Sometimes it's as pedestrian as the next thing I have coming up, and if this weren't a friendly interview, it might be an interview, but it could easily be a project in which I have to do a whole lot more work. And it could be a speech I have to give, whether it's really there or not, or even a class I have to give, whether, I really have explained it correctly. So sometimes it's something that pedestrian, but I think they're chronic worries that all of us have. that if we're really big, we'll admit them. Why doesn't so-and-so pay attention to me? That may come back again and again with so-and-so, may circle back. Or why am I not as accepted in this group as I'd like to be seen? And elements of ego will come up. Why don't they see me as as an articulate spokesperson for this particular view? I try to dissolve them when they're elements of ego. They don't get me anywhere, and they don't appeal to anyone else either. But yeah, I have the mini and the macro both come up.
Man, you nailed me perfect. You psychoanalyzed me without even asking me any questions. Tom, Audre Lorde says you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rayner responded, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest? Those quotes aside, you can apply the quotes or not.
So, Mandela and Gandhi, the son of Gandhi, had this debate constantly, whether or not ends justify means, and whether or not you can use things like sabotage that are violent to take on a state and dismantle a state without yourself receiving more violence, which ties back into the boomerang effect. And it's not resolved. I think it's a dialectic that goes on and on among political and spiritual voices, that you must model a different way, and others, if you model a different way in front of Hitler, you get clobbered. You must resist, and you must use their own tools against them, and even superior tools against them to demolish them, which ultimately is what happened when the nuclear bomb was dropped and when Hitler was bombed far more than he could bomb anymore, and so forth. So I see a double-sided answer to that. I once wrote Mother Teresa a letter asking her, because I was working on a film with all Nobel Peace Prize winners at the time, and I got about a dozen of them to write me back about whether or not communication was a really important tool for peace, since they'd all been involved in peace and so forth. And I wrote her, and she said, as part of her letter, there's no one on the world who is not worthy of being loved. She said that's one of the answers for peace. No one in the world not worthy. So of course I had to write her back and say, even Adolf Hitler. And it took 3 or 4 months before her very difficult to read and tired writing came back, because she must have gotten hundreds of letters and so forth. And those days we didn't have email, but it finally did come back, and it was words to this effect. Had everyone in Adolf Hitler's circle of family, friends, educators, neighbors, associates loved him, we would be remembering him for a totally different reason. So something to think about. I wouldn't rush right up and hug him, I'll tell you that, but it gave me something to think about.
Yeah. Well, again, you led right into the next question perfectly. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Both. To the extent that evil uses people as a vehicle, they become evil people, right? And so it's like everyone is wanting to lop off the head of Trump, and I tell them there are many more heads to the dragon. And so in that sense, evil is using not only Trump and Putin and Kim, who, by the way, are the 3 most visible people in world media today. Putin, Kim, and Trump. How's that for ethical role models for your children, right? So cut off one of those heads and another will replace it somewhere. It may not be in the White House, and it may not be in the Kremlin, although it could well be. But you're going to find that evil finds face or finds voice, or however you describe evil. But all kinds of spiritual, including the Eastern spiritual, create that it's just the absence of light, that darkness has no identity itself. And so the more you flood the world with light, and the more you, in Mother Teresa's terms, love the baby Hitler and the 2-year-old and the 3-year-old, you don't have a dysfunctional person later on. But we've never had that in the world, so we can't see if that's true. In fact, Chesterton, one of the things he said that got McLuhan going about Catholicism, he said several things. McLuhan loved his book. But one of the things he said is, don't knock Christianity, it's never been tried. And that's just the sort of thing that Marshall would love to say, because it's so shocking. You say that to a group of Christians, they all look around and say, wait a minute, what am I doing? It's never been tried. He means you can't find even a neighborhood, let alone a country, where there's no murder, where there's absolute embracing of each other, and where unconditional love is a way of life. So by virtue of that, I think we don't really know what a world would be like where everyone is, quote, shining the light, whether it's called Christianity or some other religion. We've never seen that, so we don't really know. We've seen communities that try to do that, but they often suffer against their own human nature. Even groups of monks and so forth and so on, you have sexual abuse and other problems because they're not fully fulfilled. So can we actually see that in action worldwide, 24/7, 365, a world in which something like unconditional love or shining the light all the time is tried all the time? So far, human nature has triumphed.
Wow. I've studied a little Maria Gimbutas, the great anthropologist who deemed through her research that there were societies that had no violence. So, have you ever studied her or her?
No, I haven't, but I have gone and lived with many different groups and am aware that some indigenous groups tend in that direction. But
Yeah.
I think if you really do thorough research based on as much as we know, even the people we romanticize, the various indigenous groups we look back on, some of them had, for example, human sacrifice as a practice. Many of them routinely have genital mutilation and practices like that we would see as cruel. So yes and no. I love it that some societies are less violent. But Hinduism preaches nonviolence more than almost any other group. And Gandhi had to constantly struggle within his own people, not just against the British. Untouchables and many others were, very, very physically abused to the extent that they had to do all the latrine work and all, and so there are different kinds of violence, but I think social violence has been present in every society I know about.
Yeah. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy, Tom? And I'm going to set this up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. Fellini says, I need an enemy. And Chinese proverb, he who cannot agree with their enemy is controlled by them. It's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, Tom, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you specifically react to the Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Right. So I get that. And by the way, that's a great collection of quotes. Bayard Rustin has a really good one too. Enemies should meet with enemies so that eventually they become friends or something like that. You'd have to look it up, Bayard Rustin. But in any event, it depends on the degree of enemy. If the enemy is a serial killer who has your name on their list, you deal with them at arm's length. If it's a political enemy about whom you don't have concerns regarding violence and so forth, I think it's really good that Joe Biden actually has a lot of senators and congressmen that he knows from over the decades, even though some of them might consider themselves enemies or might consider themselves rivals. Lincoln, you recall, assembled a band of rivals. So there's a book about Lincoln called that. And some people say Obama did the same thing in their cabinet. They put them together because they were the sharpest tools in the shed. And once you make them acknowledged and part of your team, it's a lot less likely that they're going to come after you and a lot less likely that you'll have an adversarial relationship over time, at least with some of them. So it depends on the degree. If they're a hyper-violent enemy, I would keep them at arm's length and do everything I could to make sure they're not a menace to society. But if they're an intellectual enemy or a rival, maybe I can learn from them. And over time, maybe I can befriend them, maybe.
Yeah. Really well put. And then Marshall learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the intent of the race, that we can look to the artist to broadcast the hidden psychic effects of the things we invent so that we can learn to cope with what we don't like about these inventions. Marshall said, we still ignore the hidden psychic effects. Why do we still ignore the hidden psychic effects of the things we invent, even though the artists are revealing them to us?
It all depends. If it's because we're materially driven and because we're obsessed with a particular goal in life and so forth, we're not only numb to a little bit, we're numb to a lot. And so we're not particularly keen to study effects or particularly keen to have a full spectrum dimensional analysis of the society we're in. We intellectuals are, but many, many, many people are just trying to either make ends meet or to beat the competition or to live a life that they see is meaningful at the 2 or 3 dimensional level that they live at. So we're not all scientists, we're not all social scientists, and therefore, if you can beat the Tao, for example, and constantly keep the Tao running, that may be your mission and your goal in life, even though it may be, dysfunctional for other people for you to do that, for you to ignore your children and other things. But serious people of conscience who study full spectrum, I think, still have problems with not understanding the difference between cause and effect, which Marshall was very concerned about. There were 4 types of cause for him. You may recall formal cause and so forth. Many people study cause at the surface level, and they don't understand the deeper levels of cause. So, for example, can we hike out for a minute? Can I give you an example?
Hike on, brother. I love this. Simplifying causality's 4 steps would be the greatest thing you can do. Like in layperson's terms.
I'm going to do it. So we're on a bus and we see that the bus is overcrowded. And so a dozen people have to stand rather than sit on the bus. And suddenly a guy on a bicycle comes in front of the bus driver, and the bus driver has to screech to a halt. When he screeches to a halt, most of the people standing fall on each other. One guy breaks his back, which is a horrible thing. And he immediately sues the guy behind him for standing too close. But the guy behind him sues the bus driver for not stopping in time. But the bus driver blames the kid who went out in front of him on the bike for breaking the rules. But the parents sue the entire bus company for not having stricter rules about having people stand. And then the more spiritual people pray to God that this will all change in society. So you've got many levels of cause there. The last people believe that God is ultimately responsible for change and can fix this. Most people are concerned that it's either the immediate thing in front of them that caused the problem, or it's the second or the third thing removed that caused the problem. But the person who sues the bus company thinks it's the structure that caused the problem.
Right.
So Marshall was very interested in that. There's a structural cause to everything, but there's also an immediate cause. And then there's a first cause, which for him, of course, was God, or theocratic first cause, Jesus, perhaps. And so I think part of the answer to your first question is that people are only stuck at one level of cause. They're not looking at the full spectrum when they don't understand the larger realm of effects. And if Ezra is correct that artists are the antenna, which made us all pick up our ears when Marshall said that, and it made a good point, we have to also consider that Ezra himself was seen as leaning very far to the right. And therefore, there are many artists who also have carried a dangerous message, not just a wake-up message.
Yeah. Tom, that was good. But those 4 steps before God, is one formal, one efficient? Which one is which? The parents suing, structural, which one's that called?
Yeah, well, formal cause really is related strongly to structural cause. But first cause predates that. And McLuhan got this language going way back to Aquinas and also to Augustine. In other words, the intellectuals in the Catholic community had been discussing the nature of cause for a long time before he got hold of it. So, and yeah, if I recall, efficient is very surface level. It's what you see and think is the cause. The formal cause is the underlying structure around it, and first cause is what created everything in the first place.
Right. Wow, that was really good. Do you think people are basically more feeling or more thinking beings? I know it's both and it depends, but just in general, off the top of your head, do you think we're more feeling or more thinking beings?
I think in an appropriate situation, there's balance, but many cultures have suffocated. So, for example, in English, we talk about, in England, the stiff upper lip and not being allowed to show the emotions. It doesn't mean they're not felt, but you're programmed. The Japanese are programmed into being very conservative about emotional displays. The Italians are told, let it all hang out. And we're a mixture of all of that in our culture, which is why we have a full range of very expressive beings and very seemingly repressed are totally distant beings, all in one culture, because we're a mixture of all that.
Tom, are you more afraid of old ideas or more afraid of new ideas?
I'm not so much afraid as concerned about ideas that are detached from reality.
Yeah.
Be they old or new.
Yeah. What does this mean by McLuhan? Everybody experiences far more than they understand, yet it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior.
Yeah, I agree. So,
how do you put that in layperson's terms?
Well, have you ever heard it said we only use 2% of the brain or 3% of the brain? I think lay people understand that. We have information coming that it would take 200% of the brain to understand. If I were to turn on a radio right now, we'd have more signals in the room than I could handle. And a radio is an old technology. If we just went online, so it's impossible. We're super saturated with more than the brain can understand. And yet that experience, if we knew how to channel it, could in fact be enlightenment, or could in fact take us to a dimension if we knew which channels and how much and how to balance and control them and so forth. So I think it's all there, but it's like using a sieve to hold the ocean. We're just not designed to hold the ocean.
It's this term I've heard, tactile situation awareness, TSA. The bomber's in the plane and he's hit and his plane's going down. He's got all these gauges to look at, what to do, and he doesn't relate to any one thing. He makes an overall doesn't relate and identify with one particular gauge. And that's what it's been compared to what people of this millennials do. They can have so many things on at once, multitasking to the most, because they're not relating to just one thing.
Right. And the more you multitask, usually you lose depth. The greater the breadth, the less the depth. And so by virtue of that, we tend to shut down much of what we're multitasking. We can only focus on one thing at a time, but we don't realize it. We think we're doing it all, but we do have to look in one direction, not in four. The eye isn't designed to do that. And yet it's for such a limited period of time, because we're about to go to the other task, that we reduce the effectiveness as well as the penetration.
Yeah. I spoke with a famous movie director 35 years ago. I says, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? He says, because we've learned to take in information faster. And I asked this question with a bias. Can we literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
No, I think over time, if a language is spoken to you, you learn the language. And we've been increasingly shown the rapid editing language. So that's why young people can thrive watching MTV and things like that, whereas other people think, oh my God, that's a blitzkrieg worth of information. I think you can adapt modalities, and that's one of the challenges that our teachers have right now in universities, is keeping up with young people who have no tolerance for reading an entire book, for example, or even a chapter anymore. They're so used to lickety-split things. It's not a matter of going to Spark Notes or something that simplifies for them. It's a matter of going to a different format that they're used to handling.
Going to a different format that I missed the end?
That is their alphabet. That is
their alphabet, yeah. That is interesting. Is their alphabet, yeah. So James Joyce was the first projectionist projectionist in Dublin. Wait a minute, there was something of, oh, I had to go back. Who invented rapid editing montage? If you're such a film scholar, dude, because this rapid editing came in blasted in 35 years ago with MTV, and Marty Scorsese says, I'm cutting my films faster because of MTV. Do you know who invented rapid editing montage, flicker frame editing?
No, I don't, but I can tell you this, that Eisenstein and many of the Russians were using it long before.
Guess who? That's just before them. 1922, Abel Gance. He was doing that. Yeah, he was doing that rapid editing, but it didn't catch on. And I mean, the 100 whatever 30 years of cinema, it's been used, but it's never, you don't see a feature film with rapid editing. You see short films like The Flicker by Tony Conrad, but that'll put you in an epileptic fit, and they have to put a warning on.
Yeah. So, if you go back and look at the early Kuleshov films, and you look at Alexander Dovzhenko, and you look at not only Eisenstein, but all of the other people who were around him, Zhiga Vertov, and many, many others, especially in Russia, they were experimenting with editing. So by virtue of that, montage had no specific formula. And you'll see a lot of speed up and a lot of slow down and a lot of anarchistic editing as well.
Yeah, I love you mentioned Zhiga Vertov. He is my hero. So just like you are, Tom, you are so dang articulate and concise, and I'm just so happy this time is spent. I'm learning so much. James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin over 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Amish argue that. I've lived with the Amish, and I've lived with some other cultures who think that all theater and all film is pretense and is fiction and therefore is dishonest. It's a lie. And so there are groups out there that totally agree with that sentiment. It depends for me on the deeper purpose. If that which is emulating life gives us insight into it that we would not otherwise have, when we're experiencing life, we don't have a V effect, as Bertolt Brecht called it. A V effect causes us to stop and think about what it is. And it's totally up to us as to whether we'll go through life unconsciously. The artist tries to be more conscious about it, tries to create a slice of something, whether or not we've seen it before, that will force us to, if not awaken, at least inquire.
Tom, what did Bertolt Brecht call it again, please?
The V effect, V, which was short for a German word called Verfremdung. Verfremdung means to make things strange. So in his plays, Brecht, unlike his predecessors, would have an actress stop and say something like, "she said," after her line, to make us realize that this is written so that we can't get lost in the illusion. The V effect had mixed results, and it's been copied in lots of ways, like when Woody Allen talks into the camera briefly or something like that. It wakes us up to the reality of the fact, oh, we're just watching a film. But when it's done really, really well, the Verfremdung effect makes you live in a duality, the duality of following the story and the narrative and having thoughts about that, but also following the act of creation and the fact that you're an audience member and thoughts about that level of interaction about the narrative that you're falling for.
Highly enlightening. I love to study Brecht, and I haven't done it, so I'm glad you taught me that. The name of my book is called Strange Questions, and Frank Zappa invented a word called xenochrony, which is strange synchronizations. So it's interesting because, Thornton Wilder did the same thing with Our Town, and he's a total Wakean dude. He came right out of James Joyce Finnegan's Wake, admittedly. But Brecht said another thing, since you brought him up, I'd love for you to comment on. He said, I'm for art that activates, not puts you in a trance. But indeed, art that puts you in a trance can activate you. So is there something I'm missing there, or can you comment on that?
No, it's true. Brecht and Godard and all of those others who were constantly living on the borderline between art and life, so to speak, and their work was always living on the borderline between art and life. They took different stands in that over time. Brecht, for example, at a certain point created more or less fantasy theater, even though much of his theater was political and constantly trying to challenge the very paradigm that he was in. And the same with Godard. Godard was always trying to make us think wherever he put his camera was a political statement and so forth. And therefore, we had to challenge wherever he put his camera and not just the script and the content and get sucked into the plot. So by virtue of that, I think they understood the challenge too, that even when you're constantly thinking about thinking, you can still get lost in your daydream. You know,
Yeah.
You can't be critical about absolutely everything all the time. There's a part of us that loves entertainment, that loves narrative. And so if every single thing that you see is a constant pulling the rug and then pulling the rug from under the rug and so forth and so on, all the way down multiple rugs, you begin to tire of the experience, and you also long for the story, the very first thing that you critiqued.
Amazing. Screenwriting teacher told me a great film, great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the exact opposite. He says, great film, great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process? Let's say, because you're a poet, I heard you recite one of your poems on the McLuhan webinar there. That was your poem. What role does intention play in your creative process, say as a poet?
Right. So for me, the question has always really been asked of the critic. Does the critic take into account the intention? And for me, I also love philosophy. This is very closely related to Kant. Kant always argued that motivation was what was most important. And we have a great story there about, let's say, Richard, you and I go to a barbecue at the end of the year, and it's a nice day and COVID is over and all of that. And I bump into the barbecue, and you grab the 5-gallon container of water to put out the fire to save my life. But you accidentally grab the 5-gallon container of gasoline. You don't realize it. And in fact, you emulate me. And so then the media comes along and says, you know, angry talk show host, you know, burns guest, you know, assuming you have some evil motivation. Let's say, though, I miraculously survive and we're at the same kind of situation a year later. And, you know, I, again, bump into the barbecue, and this time you're angry with me for whatever reason. You grab the gas to make sure I don't live to tell my side of the story. Instead, you grab the water. And so this time the media comes along and says, heroic talk show host, you know, saves the life. What they're missing there, and this is true of the media frequently, is the motive. So the motive is the intent. You've been using intentionality. Kant argues constantly that this is the most important thing, a pure-hearted motive, even with a sour outcome. Even if you accidentally kill someone, which seems horrible, that pure-hearted motive is more noble, more ethical, more elevated than a disheartening motive or a shades of gray or even a very dark motive. And so, on the other hand, Mill has always argued, again, John Stuart Mill, that outcome is what matters the most. Is it effective? Did your solution save a life? You know, that's really the most important thing to a utilitarian. So I think it depends on which one of those you are, or whether you're a little bit of both, as to how much attention you pay to the intention. So
that was really good. Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. When you're writing your poem, how much are you thinking of your audience?
Usually there's something coming through that's something like a flow that a musician would describe. It's coming through that's more important to me than I wonder if they'll like it or not. Later on, when I refine it, I may say, is this word comprehensible to most people? Or I may say, you know, I'm really wondering if this is redundant and I shouldn't just get rid of this because people have heard it before. So I think about the audience secondarily, but when it comes through, it's a chance to really experience something that's uplifting me or that's surprising me. And You know, when you hear Salieri complain about Mozart in the film Amadeus, you know, he basically says his notes come straight from heaven. You know, he's very jealous and very angry and so forth. I don't know if I can make that claim. I'm certainly not a Mozart, but I do have that experience of something coming through and that being a beautiful experience and wanting to capture it. So I want to capture it before I think about the outer court, so to speak, and what response or criticism would come or what lack of comprehension would come.
Tommy, anticipated question. George Manupelli, great experimental filmmaker, founder of Ann Arbor Film Festival. His mantra was ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says there is no self-expression. And jazz pianist Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Is art making, you sort of touched on this in your last comment, is art making, writing, whatever form, more self-expression or more a vehicle for whatever dominant technology or culture is currently present?
It depends on what your starting point is. If you're falling asleep and this great melody comes through, it's really a form of self-expression. And you know you're going to have a rich payoff, even if you have to go through and sculpt that melody for weeks or days. But if you start out with the intention of, hey, I've been preaching a lot in my lectures, I really need to do something different. I think I'll come up with a poem that says the same thing. Then you have a different starting point for your poem. Your poem has got to have a political purpose. It's got to awaken or enlighten or provide contrast to the other modes that you're using. So there have been a lot of political poets and political artists and political musicians and others who are polemical or who, as their purpose is to awaken a particular thought or activity or raise consciousness in a particular area. I think if you start with that motivation, it's very different than when something happens to you and you say, wow, that's a melody I haven't heard before. I better get that down and then develop it. So I'm working on a musical right now, and I have been for many years. It's at the stage of having a secondary level reading. And that means we're no longer reading things around a table, but people are actually singing it, and there are a few musicians involved and so forth. That's been held up by COVID. But that experience for me is much more deliberate at this stage. I really am seeking to take out lines that are dead weight. I really am seeking to think, could a person in the audience be offended by this statement? I really am. But when it first came through, and when it does come through, it's more like, wow, you know, I really am enjoying this melody. I better see if I can come up with harmonies for it. I wonder if there are lyrics that'll fit it. Very simple, practical questions like that. And there's almost a part of that that's having intercourse with your muse. People talk about their muse. That's very elevating that way. And I wouldn't want to tamper with that process. But then as you begin to refine it and shape it, and people say, I'm going to give you $10,000 if it doesn't offend all the people in the audience, then you've got to think about all the rest of it.
Tom, can art making be egoless?
Yes. Yes. And I don't know how many examples of that we have because I haven't been able to know the artist. But I think, you know, there's the story of the Zen monk living and creating one letter of calligraphy all of his life. That's the artistic process for him. He's refining it, just that one letter. And to the extent that he's shedding ego as part of his process, he thinks the letter becomes more clear and more refined. Totally different than Pablo Picasso, who's creating a new genre every decade, and sometimes much more quickly than that, and constantly wanting to showcase his work and wanting approval. And there's that huge longing for approval that's fairly close to human nature. But as you shed the longing for approval, it's the quality of the work that becomes the most important thing, rather than what the response will be.
What a great story. It helps evoke one of my heroes, Frank Zappa, who said, the big note. So I created this question. After the word the, what would you fill in to encapsulate your life? I asked Eric McLuhan, I says, you know, Joyce would go, the wake. And I said, what would your dad say after the? He said, the playground. I says, Eric, what would you say? He goes, the playground. I says, that really is good because you got the play and the ground and the multimedias. For Tom, what would you say? The blank. What would you fill in?
The up elevator.
Ah, I love it. The up elevator. Okay, thank you. So, what first attracted you to doing what you're doing? I mean, you are a multi-hyphenated dude. You're, but let's say as an educator, when you say you're professor, your main career has been educator. Would you agree there?
Yes, I think that's a fair statement. Educator,
Yeah.
writer. Yeah. And
Educator, right. Yeah. So what would you say? You're growing up and you're seeing all this. When did you go, I want to be an educator? I want to be a writer. You know, what was that kickover point?
I sort of backed into it. I always had educators in my life that I admired. So subconsciously, I was all set to emulate teachers who I really loved, who had inspired and changed me. And I'd often thought about education as well. But you know, I never ever had the thought I want to be a professor, I want to be a teacher. It was more when I was a grad assistant, I became involved in the actual experience. And when I became involved in the experience of interacting with students in a different way, I was a grad assistant at Harvard. And the fact that my professor trusted me enough to turn over some of the teaching to him kind of excited me. And usually when you're a grad assistant, it leads you to being the bottom kind of rung of the ladder. You're a lecturer and then an assistant professor and so forth and so on. And I was no different. It became a semi-addictive, and it also was a paying job, you know, to be very practical about it. And it kept me in company with the people I love to spar with. Colin had a lot of sparring partners. And that's a wonderful experience and avocation to the vocation of teaching. And so I began to realize, hey, I can not only do this, I can get paid for it, and I can get feedback on everything I like to talk about, and I can begin to have the experience that I always wondered if my professor was having. So it's a simple story for me in that way.
Really well put. Thank you, Tom. So we know the whole routine. Marshall says everything we invent extends some humanness, or as he would say, human sensorium. My friend goes, that's not even a word, but you know, I love, you know, clothing extends skin, blah blah blah, and I love the eyelid is extended by the shutter in a camera or projector. What does the writing utensil extend for you? What humanness?
The heart. I mean, it also extends the brain. So probably the heart and the brain in balance is what's desired. You may know the famous thinker and also statesman Edmund Burke. He was Irish, and he used the metaphor of the sailboat, that life should be like a sailboat for us. We need the emotions, we need passion. That's the wind that takes the sail somewhere. But we also need reason. That's the centerboard. And all emotion and no reason, and you topple. The wind topples the sail. But all reason and no passion, no sail, and you don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
And so it's the balance of the two that I want to see, a balanced heart and mind.
Yeah, it's really well put. What was the motive of the cave artist? Not what Werner Herzog or anthropologists say, but just off of your gut feeling.
So, boy, when we talk about I wasn't there, this is one I really wasn't there for to interview. So media gives us the sense of what I call the new epistemology, the sense that we really know things we know nothing about. For example, I asked my students, how many of you have opinions about Trump? They all raise their hands. About Lady Gaga, they all raise their hands. About Putin, they all raise their hands. Say, how many of you have ever spent, you know, even 6 hours off stage, off camera, off makeup with any of these people? And none of them raise their hands. So we've fallen into a state of thinking we know things that we know absolutely nothing about. And I'd say the caveman is the furthest away from anything that I might possibly contemplate on knowing firsthand. If we project that human intention, human motivation was similar back in those days, I'd say we'd have the same spectrum. They were painting partly for survival, to let people know where the big mammoths were and stuff like that, or they were painting for creative release because they didn't have a lot else to do, or they were painting comparatively to see who could do it better, or they were painting because it had a ritualistic function in their religion or whatever their sacred practice was. we can posit all kinds of reasons, but I really don't know.
Tom, it was great because usually I've asked these same questions for 30 years and someone will say, well, ritual or, to get laid or this or that. And like your answers are so dang comprehensive. You list all the ones I usually spew back to people. Say, well, somebody has said this one.
Yeah.
I love these because, I tell people, some of my questions are either or, and it doesn't matter and it depends and all that. But this one is the question I really started with 30 years ago. What's more important, conviction or compromise?
Conviction and knowing when to compromise.
Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead.
My latest book is about the toughest ethical decisions that were made in history. And I went after 200 people who I know who are in history and philosophy to see what they thought. And I compiled them. I got 110 answers. And from those, I came up with 12. And I wrote a book about the most difficult decisions that were made. The reason I'm mentioning this is because the further back in history I went, the more ambiguity I got about what I think really happened. The closer I am, the more biographies, autobiographies, documents. Malala is the most recent person in there, and of course, she and the people around her can be interviewed. But the earliest person in there is Queen Esther. Very little documentation about her. And so the caveman is further back than Queen Esther, and the levels of documentation are pretty minimal about what would have happened. So that's what raised that thought with me. The further back in history you go, the more humbling it is, usually.
Yeah. That's well put. And I love this word ambiguity. But one time I asked someone, what's more important, conviction or compromise? And they said, depends on what you mean by important.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
They shifted the whole emphasis of the question.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Tom, you brought up the word ethics, and our dear friend Andrew Crystal really helped me in preparing for this. He sent me some links to your great documents that are online, and I read them and was really enlightened. Is ethics invented or innate in humans?
So many cultures don't even have the word ethics. And so you have to assume that it's fabricated. As you know, Nietzsche thought morals were created artificially to serve the benefit of the elite and so forth. So if you take a highly political class analysis and so forth, you can see ethics is serving a function to keep the poor poor and the rich rich. You know that line of thought. But if you take a more spiritual line of thought, ethics are a codified secular way of basically protecting the dignity and the sanctity of humanity, creating rules and so forth that exhibit honor and respect for all parties and seeking fairness and justice for all. And so there are 4 levels of definition. If you look around the world for levels of definition about ethics, the first is the way of life. So the Judeo-Christian ethic, we hear about the capitalist, the communist, socialist ethic, we hear about the Fijian or the German ethic and so forth. So that way of life. The second is rules and policies and guidelines and other synonyms for professional moral decision making. What do you do in professional hotspots? And that's the kind of ethics that's often taught in graduate level schools. For example, a business school or a law school, they all have a class in ethics for professional ethics. The third level is the study of number 1 and number 2. That's what you have to do in college. When you have to take an ethics class, you're really studying those different schools of thought, but you're also studying professional and applied ethics as well. The fourth level of ethics is if you ask the woman or the man on the street, is that person ethical? And if they say he ain't got no ethics, they're going to mean, he's a politician. Whoops, did I say that? They're going to mean the person is not trustworthy or is not honest, is not virtuous. And that's the level and definition of ethics that we frequently hear, is just that kind of knee-jerk gut reaction to ethics. But in fact, I don't think we can say a particular culture is unethical. If we have Jewish and Arabic ethics in conflict, and they both point at each other and say they're not ethical. At the level of number one, actually they are ethical. They just have an Arabic or an Islamic ethic, whereas the Jewish may have a Hebrew or a traditional Torah ethic. And so it depends on what you mean by ethics is where you go with it. If you mean that way of life, every culture has an ethic that teaches moral decision making, be it the Ten Commandments or something else. If you mean professional, you may have all kinds of interesting conflicts. For example, chaplains in the military cannot carry guns because their highest ethic is serving nonviolence, serving God, and teaching nonviolence. But in the military, you're required to carry a gun. So they serve two professions. One is the military, and one is the chaplaincy, or a religious school that indoctrinated them. And so when they're in a foxhole and the enemy's coming after the troops next to them who are sleeping, they're the only one awake and there's a gun in front of them, you have the question of, do they grab the gun and shoot at the enemy to save a life? Saving a life is first and foremost within their religion. And yet they've taken a vow to their religion that they won't be violent. So you can see, even within the professions, ethics is complicated. It depends on which profession and so forth. At that gut level, many people often claim it's situational, and they won't know until they get in a situation.
Yeah.
But for me, the great ethicists take exception to that. For example, is genocide ever ethical? I love people who come right out and say, no, I draw the line there. Is rape ethical? They come out and draw the line there. Is child abuse ethical? They draw the line there. So there's some things that are not situational for me, that are not relative to culture. But I do think we have to look at all those different levels, the cultural level and so forth, to be really intellectually clear, because people mean all kinds of things when they say ethics.
Thank you so much. That was really well done. And everything you've accomplished in your life, I compliment you. What these three elements play what role? Luck, skill, ambition. What played the most important role, second and third?
So if we make ambition a happy word like purpose or purpose-driven, I'll go with the polite, sensitive version of ambition. When ambition means stepping on other people's backs to get to the top, it's not a word that I admire or follow. I'm not keen to do that. But if ambition means constantly having a GPS that sends you in a particular direction, no matter what, neither rain nor sleet nor snow, and all of that will stop me from fulfilling my goal or my mission, I'm all for mission fulfillment. So if that's what's meant by ambition, yes. But if it means ruthless, aggressive behavior, no.
What would be the next one, luck or skill?
I think skill.
T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. Tom, what language is your inner dialogue in?
In my best moments, it's things like prayer and spirituality and devotion and meditation. In my best moments. In my worst moments, it's self-judgment, self-criticism, self-effacement. And Tom, why did you do this?
Is perception reality?
Again, you have to adopt a particular philosophy to believe that. Hume and others thought that our senses determined our reality, that our reality was sense-driven. If you were a giant kind of member of another planetary species and you came and observed human beings, you would probably conclude that their perception is their reality, because they're living in a different world than you're living in. So you have to ask what universe is asking the question. I think if it's a larger universe, yes, perception is reality.
I love that. What universe is asking the question? That's a good one, Tom. Thank you. Why is it so difficult for humans to consider the possibility that life may be pointless? I'm not saying life is pointless. I'm saying, why is it hard for humans to consider that it might be?
Well, so much of culture is steeped in religion, and no religion teaches that you shouldn't have faith. The faith may be in something different than the other religion, but we have had so much inspiration from, I'd say, 10 major world religions and maybe 100 minor religions. It's hard to count them all. And none of them posit suicide as an important way out. Now, that doesn't mean existentialism and many other philosophies haven't existed. But the majority of people have been influenced by something that gives them an outer directed purpose and direction.
Lewis Carroll says, I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Tom, have you believed in any impossible things lately?
Yeah, I have. I believed for a long time that because of the way the laws of physics work and the laws of personality work and so forth, that a caterpillar can only put so many feet in its mouth before it topples over. And I'm describing Trump there when I say that. I thought the way life worked is that he would have self-collapsed much, much earlier than he appears to be doing now. And often people felt that way about Hitler and other tyrannical rulers, that because they would reap what they sowed, because they had alienated so many people, because they had made so many mistakes and so forth, that they would perish long before they could do a lot more damage. That's why they didn't speak up. So I've seen it in my own lifetime too, that people who you thought had shot themselves in the foot too many times to walk are still walking.
Tom, what element, one major element of your career, your, let's see, your aspirations has changed in your decades of doing what you do, and one major element that stayed the same?
Right. So I think the arts have stayed the same. I've always loved the arts. I had a double doctorate when I was at U of T. Half of it was in theater, and I still love theater. I still love film, still love music. I'll be performing at a kind of Christmas type ceremony Sunday. And so that's avocational at this point, although I've been a union musician for 40 years now. So in a way it's professional, but it's not what I do most of the time. So that stayed the same. I've always loved some kind of creative mode of expression. Something I think that has differed was when the United Nations reached out to me, I thought, well, yes, I will do more than be a professor. I will get involved in global projects. I've always been semi-cynical about them because no organization has ever changed human nature. The UN, lots of organizations that are out there, the League of Nations came and went, they've never changed human nature. And so despite the noble ambitions, I've always thought, I don't know, I'm not so sure I should get involved with that. But when they said there was a world ethics project that would teach ethics at every level, I thought, even if it can't change human nature, even if it can't make the major change we'd all love, what if it helps 1,000 students? What if it helps 100,000 students? What if it motivates some of those students to teach ethics themselves or to live a life that has positive influence on other people? So I think that's changed in me, that I'm willing to do more than I thought I would do on the global level.
Well done. Tom, we've got 10 more minutes for our calculated 90. Are you willing to go more than that?
I think that would be my limit, to go another 10 minutes. And I would love to talk about the latest book if it's okay. Is that okay?
Super. Let me ask you a couple more. We'll end with Clinton's got a question to ask you too. So Moshe Feldenkrais says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength. Can you tell us a weakness that you've incorporated to become a strength?
Yes. So I've always had a problem with sugar. Some people it's caffeine, and others it's alcohol and so forth. But Aristotle says the key to improving behavior is right repetition. So I've actually been able to go for a day and then a week and then 2 weeks and then a month and so forth, repeating the tendency of not going into a bakery or not going into an ice cream shop or whatever else, to a point where I actually lost 25 pounds last summer. And although that may seem like a very surface level change, it actually changed everything about me: my consciousness, my energy level, my interaction with other people. because I could sustain a certain discipline there of abstinence in an area that had been my, you talk about emotion, you have too much of the wrong sugar supply, and your emotions are not under control. So everybody has something that's different for them, but I found that a level of self-discipline like that through right repetition, which Aristotle mentioned, was very valuable in changing my consciousness, not just my body.
If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Keep going. You're great. Don't let your fears and problems set you back. You're going to have a great life, and make the most of every opportunity that you have. Express love for your parents because they tend to disappear in the background. Express appreciation for your teachers because they tend to be stepping stones. Express understanding to all the other people who are competing with you and so forth, rather than trying to beat them. And you'll be a better person.
Tom, how do you find peace of mind?
I have specific spiritual practices that I do. Every morning at 8, my wife and I have a time of enfoldment for COVID victims and many other people in the world. And we find that that gives us great inner peace. And we have a specific list of people. We participate in this with a group of people who either pray or meditate or actually write emails to COVID victims or whatever at exactly that time around the world. And there's a great sense of peace that comes from that. So there are specific practices, but when something happens spontaneously and I don't have peace of mind, if I have the presence to think of it, I do something for somebody else. And that takes my mind off myself. And that tends to bring a temporary elation, whether it's make a donation to a cause or realize somebody's waiting for a phone call and who's very lonely or whatever. And that activity tends to diminish my own pain.
Wow, I would love to join that group. Send me a link. I think that is very, very deeply needed and really moves me. So Joseph Boyce says, make the secrets productive. Lou Welsh said, guard the secrets, constantly reveal them. But it was Thornton Wilder in 28, another wake in. Art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. Tom, you laid your cards on the table for 80 minutes here. I'm grateful. It's not to insinuate you haven't. What's it really all about for you?
On that secret question, there are indigenous societies that have an inner circle to protect the wisdom of the group, and they pass it on to the younger people at a certain time. That kind of secret, I think, is noble because you don't cast your pearls before swine. If you know that saying, you don't put out there what's really sacred to you for people who will trample all over it. But that's not the same as the kind of revealing and hiding secrets at the level of Snowden and the level of political secrecy and so forth. I tend to be pretty democratic at that level unless lives are going to be cost all across the aisle and so forth. In terms of laying it out there, what's most important for me, I'm giving a talk right now about my latest book. And that book, again, is about very difficult and famous historical decisions about ethics, but it's also how do you make your own ethical decisions? How do you do that? And at the end of the night, when I finish the whole talk about it, we go through Q&A and so forth, I say, we ethicists get to preach a little. Unlike mathematicians and theoreticians and so forth, we get to preach a little. And my preachment would be take a stand. Like Tank Man, who stood in front of the row of tanks. We don't know what happened to him, whether he was executed or faded back. There are a lot of stories that are told, whether he went back to a normal life, we don't know. But when the row of tanks tried to move, he moved and stood in front of it. So I say not only take a stand, but it's important that whether your stand is the same as mine, whether your issue is the same as mine, whether your expertise or experience is the same as mine, that leads you to take a stand. The least ethical thing you can do is absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
nothing.
then it goes back to embracing contradiction, which I learned from Frank Zappa. And you brought to my attention through your papers that Pascal said, best thing you can do is to be quiet in a room, that whole idea that Pascal said that you reiterated was so touching to me because it flipped into the Duchamp line that there's no problem, there's no solutions because there's no problem. So it sounds like you're denying stuff. And so there's a lot of complexity and all that. But I was going to suggest I'll ask you one.
Let me
Go
say
ahead.
what Pascal, as best I remember the Pascal quote, and it is translated, but as best I remember it, it's all human problems reduced to one. Our inability to live quietly in one small room. We seek distraction. And so that would be an answer to enlightenment or happiness, is that ability to live quietly in one small room. And ironically, COVID is forcing many of us in that direction, literally.
So I'm going to ask you one more, then Clinton's going to come in and ask his, and then I have one to finalize. It has been an honor and a pleasure. Tom, what is the healthiest cultural shift you see developing today?
So behind the scenes, we often don't hear about it. There are many heroes. We hear about frontline responders, firefighters, and all of that. I think the cultural shift is that we're beginning to acknowledge that we don't need heroes who are billionaires. We don't need leaders who are in the limelight all the time, but that we have literally thousands of secret leaders who are doing the impossible and constantly risking their lives. And that it's not just frontline workers, although they're very important. It's not just the doctors, it's not just the firefighters, but there's a huge number of volunteers surrounding them, a huge number of people in high schools and colleges and other places coming forward to do something different, to take initiative, to volunteer. And I think that's a very healthy sign in society.
Yeah. So Clinton, if you have a question, shoot right in and answer it. If not, go ahead, Clinton. How? Well, thank you, Clinton, for facilitating us.
Gentlemen's very stimulating. I've been fighting the urge to pop in earlier, but I'd first like to point out that both Tom and I have got papers in the newest edition of New Explorations Journal, which I've just thrown a link down below in the YouTube video. So I encourage our readers to find more there.
Congrats.
In my opinion,
congrats.
Thank you very much. It's actually my first publication.
Wow.
In something of this sort, so it's really cool.
Yeah, we applaud that. That's good. If we can give you likes somewhere, let us know.
Sure, thanks a lot. In that paper, I give my own explanation or understanding for why it is McLuhan sort of didn't take moral issues or ethical stands on lots of the issues of his day, and instead would sort of throw questions towards those effects towards a media analysis. And I see criticisms from social justice scholarship today about McLuhan, which explicitly call him out for not taking stands on all sorts of inequalities of his day. I was wondering if you had an answer or an understanding as to why McLuhan acted in that, say, like, not amoral, which isn't say bad, but he put on or acted this role of not expressing moral judgments or value judgments.
Right. So as you know, he grew up in a Manitoba world, and in that world, he was still finding himself, and he only converted to a particular political and religious vision when he went to Cambridge. And certain people at Cambridge really inspired him to do that. And in the process of that, he found out as an academic, you can be criticized and not understood constantly if you wear your faith on your sleeve, if you're a devout Catholic, or if you put forth your position and your philosophy. So my view is, in talking to him and interviewing him, that he developed what we call a compartmentalized Catholic approach to the world. That is, he wore a mask. The professorial mask allowed him to pontificate about social and other issues without seeming to have a position. And that mask allowed him to have a lot more visibility and so forth if he was just reduced, trivialized, and judged as a Catholic. And so unlike many people who wear their heart on their sleeve, or their philosophy on their sleeve, or their moral view on their sleeve, he would entertain and elevate and come up with rhetorical scenarios that would cause people to get lost in a purely intellectual world, in a thinking world, much more than a feeling world, despite the fact that when I privately interviewed him, he had interviews himself with Mary. He was such a profound Catholic that he talked to Mary, and that he had a prayer cycle, and it was very intimate. But for him, it was totally protected. He had a barbed wire fence up the middle, between, and he never came right out and said publicly, frequently to people, the media are evil. That's why I'm taking them on. But one of his good friends, Gerry O'Grady, said he went from the medieval to the evil media. He did think that if we really reduce it, that the media was definitely trivializing some of the most important things, that the mass was being reduced to fodder when the microphone came in and took over the mass. All those things that were sacred to him were being converted to two-dimensional and to commercialized items. So, but had he been that simplistic, he would never have had the following, nor the income, nor the book sales, nor the role of profit for society, if he had come right out and stayed to those positions. So, but I know privately he had very strong ethical views, and you could see that in the way he treated his family. He didn't tell them to go out and be intellectually open-minded. He paraded them to mass every day. And he and his wife began to be concerned when they wouldn't go to mass anymore.
So,
wow.
Excellent. So there's this trade-off. I mean, he studied, he gave this analysis of The Great Gatsby where he describes very clearly the pseudo-sophistication of these parvenu, new celebrities, and how they had this fake sophistication for the masses, for the spotlight, all very rehearsed, and gigs. Oh, when I flash you this card, that means you kiss me now, and that'll be the best for the cameras. All this stuff, total fake charade for the cameras, right? So that was back in his media analysis in the 40s. So you're saying he sort of knew well enough to put that on for the trade-off to get the visibility or the exposure?
You have to look at much of his social behavior and his writing as a mask that he wore. He was very happy to be Professor McLuhan and very happy to be the Sage of Aquarius. He loved to play that part.
Thanks.
Yeah, very welcome.
Thank you, Glenn. That was a great question. And Tom, we want to thank you for your time and energy. And just closing, we have a final question. Really grateful to your time and energy, Tom Cooper. The last question is, what gives you the most optimism?
I'd say it's my eternal sense that I am eternal, that even if things happen to my body, and even if I'm misunderstood or treated unfairly in certain situations, that over time, the glass is neither half empty or half full. It's entirely full. It's full of air and water. And so by virtue of that, it's not a matter of being an optimist or pessimist. Being an actual realist realizes the universe is going to go on no matter what mistakes I make and how long I live. And that's a pretty wonderful thing.
Thank you, Tom Cooper. And thank you, Clinton. It's really been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you. And where do we go from here?